All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's class about the Sukkah, titled "Don't Kick the Sukkah." Now, just to start off, to get comfortable with the concept. So the Torah tells us that for 7 days we should sit in the Sukkah, and the Torah continues and tells us something very novel, that not only should we sit in the Sukkah, but unusually, the Torah tells us why we should be doing this particular mitzvah. And the Torah says, "Laman yedu darasechem," so that you should know for generations that God kept us in Sukkos throughout the 40 years that we traveled in the desert. And it was a way of God showing love to us, protecting us in the desert, not just the necessary protection in order to live, such as flattening the mountains, filling in the valleys, or killing the snakes and the scorpions, or making sure that they wouldn't attack us, but even just protecting us from the sun, making it a comfortable journey through the desert. And because of this, we are meant to sit in the Sukkah for 7 days and remember these great miracles that God did for us when He took us out of Egypt. And our sages point out, if that's the reason for sitting in the Sukkah, so why would we wait until Sukkot to celebrate? Seemingly, shouldn't we celebrate the same time as Pesach, the same time as we celebrate leaving Egypt, leaving Mitzrayim? And our sages explain. You see, if somebody were to set up a hut, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, right around Pesach time, which is usually spring, that's exactly when everybody else in the Northern Hemisphere is actually starting to set up shop, because the weather's taking a turn from winter to spring. Weather's getting nice. The sun's coming out. It's warming up. So it's comfortable. People are moving outside. People are setting up their huts that they would sit in outside throughout spring and the summer. And therefore, the Torah, our sages teach us that the Torah says when you're going to sit in a hut, if you want to represent that this is just because God commanded us, and to remember the miracles that God has done for us, and that God still does for us, that is through sitting in a hut, not during the summer, but rather as the weather starts to change in many parts of America right now. It's pretty cold and rainy. In certain places, it even starts to snow already. And nevertheless, we're still sitting in the hut, commemorating and remembering the miracles that God has done, that God did for us in the desert. Now, what's fascinating about this is that it's not just a mitzvah on its own. It's a mitzvah with a lesson. But it's not just a lesson like a teaching from a book, but it's an experience. It's an experiential teaching, which is a very powerful concept when it comes to educating ourselves and educating our children. We know that when there's action involved, when it's experiential, it's much more meaningful, much more impactful. And therefore, when it comes to Sukkos, that's what kind of experience it is. And that's what the Torah says, "Laman yedu darasechem," so that you should know for generations. Kiba Sukkos hashafti, for I put you in Sukkos when I took you out of Egypt. Now, regarding this mitzvah, our sages tell us a few fascinating ideas, which we'll be discussing tonight. One of them being, the Medrash tells us that our forefather, Avrohom Avinu, Abraham, the first Jew, what happens is we know that he's an exceptional host when it comes to doing the mitzvah of hachnasas orchim, of having guests and treating them properly. He is second to none, paralleled by no other. And the Torah records one or two stories. The Talmud tells us several stories of how far the extent of his hachnasas orchim, bringing guests, went, how far he would go for them, to what extent he would go for them. And we know one classic story where Abraham's in the middle of talking to God, and he notices 3 passers-by, and he says, "God, hold on, I'm going to go do the mitzvah of hachnasas orchim. I'm going to go bring them in." So he puts God on hold in order just to host them, give them some food so that they give them a place to rest. So he goes out, he greets them, he brings them in. Ultimately, we know that they ended up being angels. But nevertheless, he treated them with the greatest respect and the greatest form of Achnasis Archim, of how one should treat guests. And the Torah tells us he didn't just give them water to wash themselves off. He didn't just give them food and everything else they needed. He didn't just give them a place to rest. The Torah says. And he sat them under a particular tree. He had this special tree that would have amazing shade where a person would be able to rest underneath this tree. And the Medrash tells us something fascinating, that it was in honor of this mitzvah of Avrohom Avinu, to the extent that he went, that he didn't just give them their necessities by hosting them. He even gave them a tree to sit under. Because of this, his children, referring to the Jewish nation, a few hundred years later at Sinai would receive the Torah, and one of the mitzvahs that would be a reward for this Hachnasis Archim would be having the Sukkah. That just like Abraham sat his guests under a tree, his children will merit to have this mitzvah for generations, to be able to sit under the schach, under the covering of the Sukkah, the foliage that we put on top of the Sukkah. Fascinating teaching. However, we have to understand what's the connection. Seemingly a very weak connection between what Avrohom Avinu did, that because he went to such great extent when it came to doing the mitzvah of hosting guests, and he sat them under the tree, that we should have the mitzvah of a Sukkah. Now I get it that there is some kind of correlation between a tree and a Sukkah, because generally we're going to cover our Sukkah has to be covered by foliage, by something that grew from the ground. But there's a stark difference between what Avram did and how we do it. You see, one of the laws, what makes something kosher to cover a Sukkah, is that it had to grow from the ground, is number one. And number two is that right now it's disconnected from the ground. If it's still connected from the ground to the ground, it causes problems for the Sukkah. It makes the Sukkah no longer kosher, at least the area under. For example, if you have a tree that's got very wide branches and the branches go over a person's Sukkah, you need to cut those branches or move the Sukkah. So how can we even relate Avram's tree to our Sukkah? We'll get back to that. Time for another teaching regarding the Sukkah. It says in the Medrash, a different Medrash, this one called the Yalkut Shimoni, and it gives the following teaching. It says, whoever fulfills the mitzvah of Sukkah in this world, in this lifetime, will merit to sit in the Sukkah made out of the Leviathan or Leviathan skin. Leviathan is a sea creature that the Talmud tells us about, the sea creature which is mentioned throughout Psalms, throughout the writings, throughout the prophets. A sea creature which God is keeping for when Mashiach will come and we will have the great feast. And it says that whoever keeps the Sukkah here in this world will merit to sit in the Sukkah made out of the skin of the Leviathan, this type of sea creature. Now, this is a pretty problematic teaching. Firstly, we know, like we just mentioned, that if your Sukkah can't be made out of fish skin, maybe the walls can be, but the top definitely can't be. It has to be something which grows from the ground and then is disconnected. So what's going on over here? And what's the connection between the Leviathan, this fish, or the sea creature, and the mitzvah of the Sukkah? Now, before we get to explaining anything, I'm just going to mention a third teaching. And that is, it's a fascinating teaching. This one is in Talmud Tractate, Avodah Zarah. It talks about how eventually the world will come to a day of judgment at the end of time when the Messianic era will arrive. And all the nations of the world will be judged, the Jewish nation and the non-Jewish nations. You see, but it's mainly the part of the non-Jewish nations that are going to be judged are mainly going to be those who stood in the way of the Jewish people, being able to be a light unto the nations. Those who stood in the way of morality, those who stood in the way of peace. Those who stood in the way of the world becoming a better place and didn't allow others to fulfill their mission. And God's going to judge them. And they're going to realize the truth of life, the truth of reality, and how foolish they were for getting in the way and antagonizing those who learn the Torah and those who keep the Torah, realizing how much of their lives they wasted, and realizing that ultimate truth cannot be paralleled to the Torah and God. And it's at that point that they're going to complain to God and say, God, please give us one more chance. We want in on this. And God will say to them, listen, you guys messed up. They'll say, please, one more opportunity, one more chance. And God will say, you know what? I'll give you one more opportunity. And that's going to be, I'm going to give you one mitzvah. There's one command that you have to fulfill. You fulfill this correctly, and that'll make up for lost time. The Gemara says, what mitzvah is that? God says, the mitzvah of Sukkah. Why is it that the Gemara continues, says, why the mitzvah of Sukkah? And the Gemara explains, the mitzvah of Sukkah is a mitzvah that you don't really need to spend much money on. Nowadays, we spend a lot of money because our houses are very different than these temporary structures. So we buy walls, we buy wood, we buy panels. We spend a lot of money. But in truth, what's fascinating is if you look at the calendar, the time of year of Sukkos is right after the harvest season. And anybody who works in the field knows that right after harvest season, there's a lot of leftover material that can all be turned into a sukkah very easily. And it's all leftovers. It's foliage. It's not something you would use anyways. And you can craft a sukkah out of that, a beautiful sukkah, and it's not a problem. And if that's the case, it's a mitzvah that really doesn't cost a person much money. It doesn't take much effort. And there you go. So the Gemara continues. It says what's going to happen is all of these non-Jewish nations who once stood in the way of God, once stood in the way of the Torah and the Jewish people, they're going to run, making themselves sukkahs. They will make a sukkah, and they will sit in it. As soon as they sit in it, the Gemara says, God is going to make the sun come out and make it very, very hot, very uncomfortable. And what's going to happen is these non-Jews will leave the sukkah, and as they leave the sukkah, because of the discomfort, they will kick the walls of the sukkah. And then God will say, I told you, in the first place, you guys were not fitting for a proper judgment. You were not fitting for a portion of the world to come. You were no good the entire time. And that's the end of that narrative. Now, just to understand it, first of all, why did God have to play this whole game in the first place? Why couldn't God just give them judgment and not give them a second chance? What was God trying to do with the mitzvah of Sukkah? Was this a game? And if God was going to take the sun out and make it too hot and too unbearable to sit in the sukkah, why did God have to do that in the first place? Now, if it's the fact that they left the sukkah because it was unbearable, we are going to explore in a few moments how during unbearable circumstances, a person does not need to sit in the sukkah. And if that's the case, why would God blame them for leaving the sukkah? The truth is, it's not just because they left the sukkah. That's not the issue. The issue is that they kicked the sukkah on the way out. But again, what does this mean? What's this teaching us? What exactly is this little piece of Talmud coming to convey? To understand this, let's understand why sukkah is an easy mitzvah. You see, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Lubavitch, Chabad, explains something fascinating. You see, one thing that separates the mitzvah of sukkah from all other mitzvahs is something fascinating, right? We just had Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day that we fast. Now, if somebody's sick and they're adopted and they're in a situation where they can't fast, they obviously don't need to fast. But imagine Yom Kippur comes and you're just not in the mood of fasting. You're just not feeling it. You're just really, really hungry. You're uncomfortable. Can you fast based on just a regular level of discomfort? No way. Take the mitzvah of shofar. Take any other mitzvah in the Torah. You're a little bit uncomfortable. Does that give you a right not to do the mitzvah? No. We still do the mitzvah, even if we're uncomfortable. Because whether we like to do a mitzvah or not, whether we're comfortable with it or not, ultimately, it's not about serving ourselves. It's about serving God. And if it's about serving God, whether we're comfortable or not, the command is still there, and therefore it must be fulfilled. We may struggle with it, and that's okay. That's normal. But that doesn't let us off the hook. However, when it comes to the mitzvah of sukkah, something fascinating. Like I said, we don't find this by any other mitzvah. It says in the Gemara, "Hamitzdair patur min sukkah." Somebody who is uncomfortable, somebody who sits and because being in the sukkah will cause them discomfort, they don't need to sit in the sukkah. And the Gemara brings different stories of different sages who, because of certain levels of discomfort, left the sukkah. Ultimately, the Gemara rules and is brought in the code of Jewish law that, for example, if it rains too much to the point that it's going to ruin your food, you don't need to sit in the sukkah. If there's a really bad odor because of the ground where the sukkah is or something happening right outside the sukkah, a person can step out of the sukkah, go into the house and eat. If it's unbearably hot, a person can go into the house. If there are too many bugs, too many mosquitoes that are biting, a person can go into the house. And therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek explains that's why it's called an easy mitzvah. Because it's an easy mitzvah that as long as you're comfortable, you do it. And as soon as you're uncomfortable, there's no longer the mitzvah to do it. If that's the case, that only makes the question on the whole story with the non-Jews coming and going from the sukkah, it makes it more complicated. Because what did they do wrong? And what was God trying to prove? So, the Tzemach Tzedek continues to explain based on a fascinating statement in the Zohar. And the Zohar talks about two types of love. You see, they tell the story of there was once a very, very poor fisherman. Right? He used to try to make a living by fishing, catch some fish, bring it to the town, sell, barter, make a little bit of money, hopefully make enough food, make enough money to buy some food and clothing, keep a roof over his head, support his family, and that was it. One day he's fishing, and he pulls out a huge pike fish. And he gets very excited, and he says, "Oh, the Baron loves pike." And fish thinks to himself, "Fish, it's phew. I thought I was a goner, but if the Baron loves fish, then I have some hope." So the fisherman takes the pike to the Baron's house. When he's greeted by the guards at the mansion, the guard says, "Yes, what do you have?" He says, "I have pike for the Baron." The guard says, "Oh, Baron likes pike." And the fish is thinking, "Oh, my chances of survival are only rising. Thank God that Baron loves pike." He comes into the house, goes towards the kitchen. He shows the kitchen staff, "Look, I have pike." And they all say, "Oh, the Baron is going to love this. The Baron loves pike." And the fish thinks, "Certainly, I'm going to survive." The Baron walks into the kitchen and says, "Pike? I love pike. All right, take off the head, take off the tail, fillet it, and cook it." And the fish's last words were, "Why did you have to lie? Why did you say you love me?" You see, so the Zohar explains there are two types of love. That there's a love when you love somebody. You can even love them to the point that you want to help them, you want to do things for them. But ultimately, it's because you feel good being able to help them. You feel good being able to do things for other people. It's self-fulfillment. Now, ultimately, it's selfish. It's a selfish motive. Even though practically the person is helping other people, that's amazing. That's good. But ultimately, the motive is selfish. But then there's another type of love, right? Just like the Baron who loves fish. Then there's another type of love. There's a love where you care so much about the other person. It's not about whether you are the one to help them or not. It's about that they get the help they need. They get what they need and even what they desire. It's completely not about you. It's the fact that you love them so much, not yourself or how they make you feel. And that's a completely altruistic type of love. And therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek explains based on this. He says, when it comes to doing mitzvahs, there are two reasons why a person could do a mitzvah. One is self-interest. You see, when a person does a mitzvah out of self-interest, it's all about the fact that I'm doing the mitzvah. And therefore, at the moment that I can't do the mitzvah, they get upset. What's happening here? I wanted to do this, right? You have these people sometimes, they love doing you favors, but the moment somebody else does you a favor, they come in and they're very angry. Hey, why did he do it for you? I wanted to do it for you. And they're very, very entitled to being the ones. I always do it for you. I want to do it for you. What do you mean? I needed it done. Somebody else did it. Aren't you happy that somebody did it for me? And the Tzemach Tzedek explains this is what happens. The nations of the world, they get the opportunity of a mitzvah to sit in the sukkah. They say, oh, we get to do what God wants. And God was testing them. God was saying, let's see if the reason why you're going to do a mitzvah now, is it for your own self-interest or is it for my sake, God says. And therefore, as soon as God gives them the mitzvah, he takes it away from them by bringing out the sun and making it uncomfortable circumstance. By taking away the mitzvah. Now, the ones who care about God's will either happily or at least humbly leave the sukkah. Why? God gave it, God took it back. There's no reason to get angry. It's all about what God wants. But the ones who are there for self-interest, they get all upset, they get all angry. Hey, I wanted to do something for God. God, how dare you take away the opportunity for me to do something for you? Their own self-interest. And that's what God says. He said, you see, you kick the sukkah not because you were upset you couldn't do a mitzvah for my sake, God says. You're upset because you didn't get the opportunity to fulfill your own self-interest. God happened to be the item of their self-interest in this case. But today it's God, tomorrow it's something else. And you have the same thing in relationships with certain people. Today you might be their item of interest. But as soon as you're not, they're not going to bend over backwards for you. They're not going to necessarily go to the world's end to help you out. Because ultimately it's about their self-interest. But then there's a love where it's completely not about self-interest. It's all about the other person. It's all about God. And therefore God gives and God's take. For me, it's all going to be about, if this is what God wants, good. If this is what God doesn't want, also good. Why? Because it's never about me. It's about God in the first place. A story that illustrates this idea was there was once two famous brothers, Rabbi Elimelech and Rabbi Zusha. Rabbi Zusha was known as Zusha of Anatolia, back in Ukraine, White Russia, and Elimelech of Lizhensk. They were amazing Torah scholars, amazingly pious people. And they used to travel around from town to town disguised as beggars. They would teach Torah, they would collect money for other people, not even for themselves. They were once accused of being thieves in a particular city, and therefore they were thrown into prison. While they're sitting there in prison, it's almost evening, it's the time to pray mincha. And Rabbi Elimelech starts crying. He sits down, he's crying. Rabbi Zusha sees Elimelech, he says, my brother, why are you crying? God is with us, we're okay. We'll be out of this prison, don't worry. He says, no, that's not why I'm crying. He says, so why then do you cry? He says, because right now is the time to pray the afternoon prayers, mincha. And the problem is I can't. You see, there's a chamber pot in our cell. And they were in a cell with about 20 or 30 other prisoners. And he says, you see, there's a chamber pot here. And the law states, Jewish law says, that you're not allowed to pray in front of excrement. And the chamber pot was full. It says it's inappropriate to pray here to God. And now I'm going to miss mincha the first time in my life. How can I miss mincha? How can I miss praying to God? So Zusha says, he says, don't be upset. This is the same God that is telling you to pray right now is telling you not to pray. So why are you not as happy now to fulfill God's will as you are when you can pray? The Melech thought about this profound idea for a moment and realized, exactly, if it's about me, I get nervous the moment Jewish law doesn't allow me to do something, even if I want to do something for God. But he realized it's not about me, it's about God. And he got so excited, he was filled with joy. Rabbi Elimelech and Rabbi Zusha in this little cell in the middle of nowhere, they get up and they put their hands on each other's shoulders and they start dancing. They're singing and they're dancing out of the greatest joy. The guards hear the noise, the ruckus, they don't like it. They come and they ask the other prisoners, says, what's all the ruckus about? They point to the two rabbis with the beards and the flowing tzitzis. They say, them, and they're dancing. So they come to them and say, why are you guys so happy? Why are you dancing? What's the joy? So Rabbi Elimelech points to the chamber pot. Doesn't say anything, he just points and continues dancing. So the guard says, "Oh, this is what's making you so happy?" He takes it out of the cell. As soon as he takes it out of the cell, they started dancing more. So now we get to daven mincha also. You see, but the point of this story is to bring out that if we make it about ourselves, we get very nervous when certain things, and especially within religion, don't fit the box that I wanted to. But if I realize in the first place that it's not about me, it's not about what I'm comfortable with, what I decided to do in the first place, it's about what God wants. So then I'm at ease and I'm very calm with whatever the situation will be. Just like we have with this pandemic over the past several months, there are many religious activities that cannot have been performed. Right now in Israel, they're having trouble making minyanim. In Australia, under lockdown, they couldn't have minyanim, they couldn't have shul for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Many parts of America, minyanim, they either didn't have or they had in smaller numbers. Many people couldn't make it. And over the past few months, this was a big problem that people got very nervous. How can I not go to shul to pray? At times, God says, come to shul. And at times, God says, I know I want you to come, but right now you have to stay home because that's what Jewish law mandates. And therefore, when it comes to the Sukkah story, that's where these nations failed to realize that sitting in the Sukkah wasn't about self-interest of doing what God wants. It was about completely being there for God. God says, I knew in the first place, you guys were here for selfish motives, selfish reasons. And therefore, I just proved the point by this whole game with the Sukkah, but it wasn't really a game. It was to see, are you here for yourself? Or are you here for me? And God says, but I know by the Jewish people that they are completely here for me. Why? Look at us. Throughout the ages, the persecution that we've been through, the exiles that we've gone through, the invasions, the pogroms, the genocides that we've been through. But guess what? We're always back. We're always there committed. We're sitting in the same sukkahs that our ancestors sat in 3,300 years ago. God says, this is a nation. This is a people who are committed, not in it just for their own self-interests. Now, this may raise a question of, if that's the case, so, seemingly leaving the sukkah is a very noble thing, to the point that the Talmud says that when it rains on sukkahs, and a person is sitting in the sukkah, the person should walk out of the sukkah, not kick it, but rather walk out of the sukkah, in a very humble manner. In other words, leaving reluctantly, but leaving because right now it's uncomfortable in the sukkah. And therefore, the Jewish law says you can leave the sukkah, just like we explained. Don't kick the sukkah because, don't get mad that you can't do the mitzvah because this is God telling you right now is not the time to do it. To the point that the Gemara says that when a person sits in the sukkah and it starts to rain, it's comparable to a servant who brings his master a cup of water, and the master rejects the water and pours it back on the servant. In other words, God's saying, I don't need you in the sukkah right now. So go back inside. Right now, it's too uncomfortable to be out here. Now, the exception to this rule is the first night of Sukkot, we have to eat at least an olive size in the sukkah, regardless of how much it's going to rain. But besides an olive size, one can go in the house. So this might raise some eyebrows because we know that in Chabad, we are pretty particular about being in the sukkah. It's not just Chabad, a few other groups, but Chabad is pretty famous for it and scrutinized worldwide for it. But we still stay in the sukkah, and many of us still stay and eat in the sukkah, no matter how much it's raining. It can be raining, hailing, snowing. We sit, we get wet, our shirts get wrinkled, turns colors, but we stay anyways. But seemingly, how does that fit with everything we just explained? So, one way of understanding this is, as the Kotzker Rebbe, Menachem of Kotzk, once said, that sometimes it's more painful to be in the house than to be in a wet sukkah during the time of Sukkot. And therefore, it's the lesser of two evils. You'd rather be in the sukkah getting wet than be in the house and eating. That's one approach. Another approach is, it says, Hamitzta'er. Somebody who's in pain has to leave the sukkah. And the way they explain this is like, the whole concept of the sukkah, at least one of the ideas behind the sukkah, is to cultivate an attitude of gratitude. We're sitting in the sukkah in a way of humility and gratitude towards God for all the good that he bestows upon us and he did throughout history. Now, if a person is sitting in the sukkah and they're uncomfortable because they're getting wet or because it's too hot or because they're getting bitten up by mosquitoes, it's impossible to sit there uncomfortably, because when a person's uncomfortable, you're only aware of yourself. And when a person is sitting there like that, it's impossible to have humility and gratitude. So it's impossible for them to fulfill the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. Because like we said before, it's not just about sitting there physically. It's also about being present in the mind in the sukkah with humility and gratitude. And if a person's so uncomfortable that all they can think about is themselves, they can't come to humility and gratitude, that's okay. Go inside and eat. There's no need to be in the sukkah right now. However, if a person can transcend that and not be so caught up in their discomfort, then this reason doesn't apply because they're not in pain. And if they're not in pain because they've reached the level of transcendence, then they can sit in the sukkah, no matter what the circumstances are, with humility and gratitude. And then all of a sudden, this dispensation doesn't apply anymore. Because if I've transcended those physical needs and those physical discomforts, I'm not uncomfortable anymore. And I have no excuse to leave the sukkah. And I get to sit in the sukkah and continue with God. And God's not asking me to leave. Because if you look at the Gemara says the one who's uncomfortable. In other words, if the rain makes us uncomfortable, then that's God telling us to leave. But if we've transcended that, that's God saying, I want some personal time with you. Everybody else can leave. Now, why is it that the sukkah, right, now we're going to try to tie everything together from the beginning. Now, why is it that the sukkah brings out this concept of being completely committed to God, and that it's not about my own motives, my selfish motives or ulterior motives, but rather about my commitment to God? Like we said about the two types of loves, the two types of ways of doing mitzvahs. So like this, it says in Proverbs, "B'chol derechecha de'eu," in all your ways you should know him, which our sages explain that means. You should know God and be aware of God, not just when you're learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, praying, engaged in spiritual or holy activities. You have to know God and be aware of God, even in the most mundane activities when you're doing business, when you're checking your emails. In all of these areas, a person should be knowing God. In other words, doing mitzvahs is about doing things for God. B'chol derechecha, knowing God in all your ways, is about being there for God or being for God. It's a God-conscious mindset. Wherever I go, no matter what I'm doing, I can be doing the most mundane thing. But what's on my mind? God. Now, such an awareness will, brings out, comes out from this. What it does to a person in life, it constantly reminds us, we didn't create ourselves, we were created. Our Creator gave us a purpose, and that means that there's a weight to every action that I do. Because if I was created for a purpose, that means every moment that I exist, I have a purpose, because I'm being aware of my Creator at every moment. And that means there is meaning and purpose behind everything that I do, every interaction that I have, no matter how mundane it may be. And therefore, we start living life, not from a place of what do I get out of it, but rather, what does God want from me at every moment? It's an amazing way to live life. It's no longer just about me, it's about the bigger picture. It's about everything around me. And I am a part of it because I am God's ambassador. I am God's extension to be able to fulfill that, to be able to accomplish that. And I can experience that at every single moment in every interaction, no matter how mundane or how holy. And like it says in the Talmud, I was only created in order to serve my Creator. And there is no other purpose to my existence. It means every single moment. Now, if we understand the nature of the way the mitzvah of Sukkah is, and this is another area where Sukkah is different than all their mitzvahs, we can understand why mitzvah brings out this concept in the fullest. This concept of knowing God in all of your ways. You see, The Torah tells us, Gemara explains it, and brought down in Jewish law, is that Teshu Ke'en Tedur. The way we have to live in the sukkah is live in it the way you live in your house. Which means, don't go to the sukkah to pray. Or at least don't go to the sukkah just to pray, I should say. Go into the sukkah and live in it like it's your living room, like it's your dining room. Don't change the way you live your life. Just change the location. Move from inside the house to inside the sukkah. You check your emails, do it in the sukkah. You sit on the couch and relax, talk to your wife, talk to your children, talk to your spouse, do it in the sukkah. You're going to read a book, do it in the sukkah. You're going to make a phone call, connect with friends, hang out with friends, do it in the sukkah. As long as you're not doing anything disgraceful or anything that's, anything disgraceful, do it in the sukkah. Why? Because that is the beauty of the mitzvah of sukkah, is all about. Sorry. Now, so whatever you're going to do it in the mitzvah, in the sukkah. Don't change the way of your life. This concept brings out the fullest idea of know God in all of your ways. See, this is the one of the mitzvahs. You don't have to do anything special. Just be yourself. Just do it in a different place. And this brings out the concept of knowing God in all of your ways and really getting to know God, even in the most mundane way, in the most mundane places. Now, a person who can start to live life like this with the sukkah, in other words, the sukkah gives us that ability, not just on sukkah, 7 days, we gather the strength for the entire year ahead, that we get to live our life the way we want to live it, but by recognizing God. And the moment that happens, it completely changes our perspective. You see, is Judaism a burden or is it a pleasure? So the person that looks at Judaism as there's my life, there's Judaism and I have to succumb to a certain set of rules and I have to fulfill all these obligations, it's annoying. It's a burden. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of different details and there's always something else. But as they say, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. When a person can realize how God is in every aspect of their life, and therefore even in areas where there is no direct command one way or another, we are constantly recognizing God. So automatically living the lifestyle of a Jew uses the two together, and all of a sudden living with God becomes natural, becomes normal, just like I can chill with my friends and hang out, and that is godly. So all of a sudden doing a mitzvah is just an extension of that. Doing a mitzvah is representation of that. And that is brought out to the fullest by the mitzvah of sukkah. So when God wants to see our commitment, that is brought out in the most beautiful way by the sukkah. Now, before we continue, I just want to say that tonight's class is dedicated to the mother of Tamar Heifetz, Yeshua Bas Rifal Samach. May tonight is her yahrzeit. May her neshama have the greatest aliyah, the greatest ascent by coming back down here to this world. And may she beseech God on behalf of all of us. Good blessings for all. Now, based on this idea, we can now understand why Sukkot is referred to as Zman Simchaseinu, the time of our happiness. You see, one of the things that gets in the way of happiness the most, and probably the greatest obstacle to happiness, is ourselves. When we're too caught up with ourselves, too self-obsessed, we get in the way of our own happiness. As they say, the gates to happiness open outwards. And the idea here is that as long as we're going to be focused on our self-interest, on our selfish motives, we are always going to end up with disappointment. We are always going to end up not having what it is that we want and being fully satisfied. The moment we shift our attention, not to ourselves, but to God, to other people, those around us, to the bigger picture, and realize that I play an integral role, and at every moment I have an opportunity to play that role, that's a truly happy person. That's a person who can sit in the sukkah in the rain, can dance in the rain, can transcend those temporary needs and feelings of discomfort, and have true joy Now, in general, this concept also makes a person a better parent, a better spouse, a better child, a better business partner, you name it. As long as you're focusing on the other person, as long as you're focusing on the bigger picture, it makes these things a lot smoother. They flow. And you can always be that person in the position to help. Now, let's just wrap up the few questions that we asked. We asked in the beginning about Avrohom Avinu that because he had Hachnosas Orphan, that's why we got the reward of the Sukkah. So the idea is like this. The Rebbe explains, the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains, that what was so special about Avroham's Hachnosas Orphan, the way he treated guests, was that he didn't just do the bare minimum. It wasn't about his own self-motives, his own self-interests of, I want to do good things for people because it makes me feel good. And how do we see that? Because he went to the world's end in order to do it, to the point where he sat them under the tree, a special tree that he planted just for that purpose, which that showed that he wasn't in it for selfish purposes, but rather for the great idea of helping out other people. And God saw this, and God says, you know what? Because of that, I'm going to reward your children with the Sukkah, which represents the same exact concept as we just explained. Now, what about the schach issue that ours is disconnected, Avram's is connected? You see, without getting into too many details of this, but Avrohom Avinu, we know that all the mitzvahs he did except for one, which was the circumcision, were not God commanded or commanded by God. They were done on his own initiative. Now we know that when it comes to doing mitzvahs, we connect with God. And therefore, when we do a mitzvah, we truly transcend everything around us. But that's as long as God has given us the command. But because Avrohom Avinu was not given the command, except for in one area, so anytime he did a mitzvah, anytime he did a spiritual service, he did someone a favor, whatever form of mitzvah he did, he was always limited by the fact that it was initiated by him. And the Rebbe says that's represented in the fact that the tree, his schach, his covering, was still connected to the ground, which meant the limitation of the fact that it was coming from Avram. However, our sukkahs, we have to disconnect it from the ground because that shows on the idea of transcendence, that it can truly transcend. And why do we have that power? Is because we got the Torah a few hundred years after Avrohom Avinu. Now, why is it that the merit of sitting in the sukkah will bring about our ability to sit in the sukkah made out of the skin of the Levyasan? You see, the word Levyasan comes from the word Levi, or Levia, which means to hug, to embrace. And that's the idea of every mitzvah ultimately is about embracing God, connecting with God. In this world, as much as we connect with God and as many mitzvahs as we do, we don't fully experience that connection. We don't fully feel it in a full way. But when Mashiach will come, the idea of sitting in the sukkah made out of the skin of Levyasan means that we'll be able to experience this idea of knowing God in all your ways, but in a way where it's like we're embraced. We're actually going to feel it and experience it. And that's what the world is going to be like when Mashiach comes. Thank you for joining us tonight. May we truly have Izman Simchasenu, a time of happiness. May we truly merit the time of Mashiach, where there'll be no more pain, no more hunger, no more suffering. And may we'll be able to merit sitting in the Sukkah Levyasan, connecting with God. And as is brought in Shulchan Aruch, that many have the custom to say whenever they leave the Sukkah, may it be the will of God that we should merit to sit in the Sukkah of the Levyasan speedily in our times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.